It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Quiet streets, familiar faces, and routines that repeated themselves day after day. Tammy King was part of that rhythm. To the outside world, she looked like someone who blended into everyday life without drawing attention. But behind closed doors, something was slowly breaking. Something no one around her truly noticed until it was far too late. Tammy was known as dependable, calm, and private. She wasn't the type to overshare or create drama. Friends described her as someone who kept going, even when life became heavy. She worked, she handled responsibilities, and she tried to maintain normalcy, even when cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. Those closest to her later said there were moments when she seemed distant, as if her mind was elsewhere, but nothing that raised immediate alarms. In the days leading up to her death, nothing appeared unusual. There were no frantic phone calls, no obvious signs of danger. Tammy followed her usual routine, interacting with people who would later struggle to understand how something so violent could emerge from such ordinary days. That sense of normal life is what made the case so disturbing. The crime didn't arrive with chaos or warning. It arrived quietly. When Tammy was reported missing, concern spread slowly at first. It wasn't uncommon for adults to go a day or two without checking in. But as hours turned into days, the worry deepened. Her absence didn't fit her personality. She didn't simply disappear without explanation. Something felt wrong, and that feeling soon became impossible to ignore. Investigators began piecing together her last known movements. Every conversation, every message, every small interaction suddenly mattered. Surveillance footage was reviewed. Phone records were examined. What initially looked like a simple missing person case began to reveal inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away. The timeline didn't add up, and certain details raised uncomfortable questions. As the investigation deepened, attention shifted to the people closest to Tammy. This is often where truth hides, not because guilt is guaranteed, but because proximity reveals patterns. Detectives noticed subtle contradictions in statements. Small details changed when stories were repeated. These weren't dramatic mistakes, but quiet ones, the kind that stand out to trained investigators. The atmosphere surrounding the case grew heavier. What started as concern turned into dread. Authorities began to prepare for the possibility that Tammy was no longer alive. That shift is one of the hardest moments in any investigation, when hope begins to fade and reality takes its place. The discovery came as a shock, even to those who feared it was inevitable. Tammy's body was found, and with that discovery, the case transformed from a search into a homicide investigation. The scene told a story, one of violence and betrayal, of fear and final moments that no one should ever have to experience. Forensic teams worked carefully, knowing that every detail mattered. Injuries were documented, evidence was collected, and the environment was analyzed to understand what Tammy had gone through. The findings painted a disturbing picture. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act. As news spread, the community reacted with disbelief. People who had crossed paths with Tammy began questioning their own assumptions. How could this happen without anyone realizing the danger she was in? How could someone suffer in silence so completely? Investigators continued following the evidence, and slowly a clearer picture began to emerge. Tammy's life had not been as stable as it appeared. There were tensions, unresolved conflicts, and emotional pressures that had remained hidden from public view. These pressures didn't excuse what happened, but they helped explain how events escalated to such a brutal outcome. Interviews became more intense. Those questioned felt the weight of scrutiny, knowing that the truth was closing in. One person in particular stood out, not because of dramatic behavior, but because of how carefully controlled their responses were. Calm on the surface, yet increasingly inconsistent beneath. When confronted with evidence, the cracks widened. Timelines shifted. Explanations became strained. What had once sounded believable now felt rehearsed. Investigators recognized the signs. They had seen this pattern before. The arrest, when it finally came, was met with mixed emotions. Relief that a suspect was in custody, and horror at the realization of who it was. The idea that someone so close to Tammy could be responsible made the crime even more disturbing. This wasn't an act of random violence. It was personal. As the case moved toward court, details emerged that changed how people understood Tammy's final days. The emotional strain she had been under, the warning signs that now seemed obvious in hindsight, and the tragic truth that her death might have been prevented if those signs had been recognized sooner. The courtroom became the place where Tammy King's life was reduced to evidence, timelines and testimony. Every word spoken carried weight, because it wasn't just about proving guilt. It was about giving meaning to a life that had been taken in a violent and senseless way. Prosecutors laid out their case carefully, step by step, showing how events unfolded and how the evidence pointed in one clear direction. Jurors listened as forensic experts explained injuries and causes of death in clinical terms. These explanations were difficult to hear, but necessary. They revealed the brutality of the crime and confirmed that Tammy had suffered in her final moments. The silence in the courtroom often felt heavier than the testimony itself. Witnesses described Tammy as someone who tried to keep peace, even when situations around her became unstable. Friends spoke of subtle changes in her behavior, moments when she seemed withdrawn or emotionally exhausted. These details, once overlooked, now formed a pattern that helped explain the emotional environment leading up to the murder. The defense attempted to introduce doubt, suggesting alternative interpretations of the evidence. But each attempt seemed to fall short when compared to the physical facts. Timelines, digital records, and forensic findings aligned too closely to ignore. The story the evidence told was consistent, and it contradicted the version presented by the accused. One of the most unsettling aspects of the trial was the motive. It wasn't driven by sudden rage alone, but by control, resentment, and a refusal to accept change. This wasn't a momentary loss of control. It was the result of emotional build-up, unresolved conflict, and a mindset that saw another person not as a human being, but as an obstacle. As the trial progressed, the image of Tammy King became clearer. She was not just a victim, she was a person with plans, relationships, and a future that was stolen from her. Prosecutors made sure the jury understood that, emphasizing that behind every piece of evidence was a real human life. When the verdict was finally read, it brought a sense of closure, but not peace. Justice in cases like this is never complete. A conviction does not bring back what was lost. It only acknowledges the truth and holds someone accountable for irreversible actions. Sentencing marked the end of the legal process, but the emotional impact of the case continued to ripple outward. Tammy's loved ones were left to rebuild their lives without her. The community was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that violence can exist even in familiar places, hidden behind ordinary routines. The disturbing murder of Tammy King serves as a reminder of how easily warning signs can be missed and how silence can become dangerous. It shows how emotional control, unresolved conflict, and denial can escalate into irreversible tragedy. Most of all, it highlights the importance of paying attention, of listening, and of taking concerns seriously, even when they don't appear dramatic at first. Tammy's story is not just about how she died, but about how she lived, and how the systems around her failed to protect her. Her case forces us to ask difficult questions about responsibility, awareness, and how many other stories remain hidden until it is too late. In the end, what makes this case so disturbing is not just the violence itself, but how quietly it happened. No warning sirens, no public breakdown, just a life slowly pushed toward a tragic end, unnoticed by most, until the truth could no longer stay buried. Tammy King deserved more than to become a headline. She deserved safety, understanding, and the chance to move forward. Remembering her story is not about fear, but about awareness, because behind closed doors, the most dangerous stories are often the ones that look the most ordinary from the outside.